Okay, so we have talked about National Research Foundation and what we have not discussed about what it is, but we have mentioned in a passing mention that National Research Foundation is something that the policy envisions. So this is going to be like, this has been like the suspense element of the policy so far. So we'll discuss what National Research Foundation is going to do, or what the policy envisions it should do. Research and innovation investment in India, first of all. So the spending towards education itself is less than 6%, and the policy wants it to go to 6% of India's GDP, and within that only 0.69% of GDP is allotted to research and innovation investments, which is very low. When you consider it relatively, the USA spends around 2.8%, South Korea 4.2%, Israel 4.3%. Now we're not talking about the size of the country's GDP. So it can be different, or it can be bigger, or it can be smaller. We're talking about percentages. Even percentage wise, the other countries that are discussed here are far better than what India spends on research and innovation. So that's one thing that needs to be bridged, for which the National Research Foundation is going to be set up. NRF to enable a culture of research in universities. So first of all, there's going to be some level of interest and some level of promotion of innovation and research that's going to happen, and that is going to be facilitated by NRF. What apart from these the NRF are going to do, it's going to have major initiatives to seed and grow research, and then research funding. So these are two broad areas that the NRF is supposed to do. One is cultivate the interest and cultivate a community of research and innovation to thrive in universities. The second is provide financial assistance for the same to happen. So NRF to coordinate with all these agencies to provide research funding. So these are all the other, some of the other agencies that have been funding research in our country in different streams for quite some time now. So some of the institutions have been listed here. This is for you to read. There's nothing that is very specifically interesting here. NRF to be governed independent of government. So this is one aspect that is very curious here. There are going to be a rotating board of governors. So there's going to be a board, and this board will not have any government interference, and there comes a doubt that this board might become sort of very autonomous and very independent and very unsupervised, for which the policy proposes a checkpoint, which is rotating board of governors. So the board of governors will be a body where the members will keep switching, that the team will not be composed of similar individuals for a longer period of time. So these are going to be the broad four-pronged functions of NRF. First, fund research. For the existing research programs, the NRF will continue to provide research assistance. The second is cultivate a sense of research and innovation ideas. The third is it should act as a bridge between the existing industries and the existing academic and academia people, and then provide a sort of a bridge between these, so that the research ideas that are being innovated and put forth in the educational institutions are transformed to viable production techniques or products or services in the industries that are already thriving. So the fourth is recognize outstanding research. So this in terms of prizes, awards, recognitions and all that. Next is transforming the regulatory system. So this policy more or less sort of reduces the government regulation or the strict red tape mechanisms that are being associated with the education system thus far. The policy keeps mentioning about something called light but tight regulatory framework. Light but tight means there are going to be some set of guidelines for the educational institutions to follow, but there is going to be a significant leeway given to them to sort of explore around these regulatory mechanisms. Distinct and independent bodies to oversee the four different aspects. Again, this was one thing that we saw in the school education part as well. So the four aspects here are regulation, accreditation, funding and academic standard setting. So these four things which are taken up by one body is going to be split into four different bodies. Those four different bodies are given here. So regulation is going to be taken up by NHERC, accreditation by NAC, funding by HEGC and academic standard setting by GEC. So when it becomes four siloed bodies, there needs to be someone to supervise all their functions and kind of bring everything to one integrated functional element. So that integration part will be taken care of this umbrella institution, that is going to be HECA. So how this looks like? There's going to be HECA, which is the Higher Education Commission of India. This HECA has supervises four different components, which are NHERC, NAC, HEGC and GEC. Yeah. So what is NHERC? NHERC is National Higher Education Regulatory Council. So this will specifically take care of the regulation part. So essentially, the functions of these functions of NHERC can be covered in these two broad points. The first is how the institution governs itself, what are the transparency and accountability in terms of what the spending is, how transparent they are in putting forth their financial statements, what are the different split in terms of where they spend their amounts on, how much is spent on infrastructure, how much spent on student well-being and all that. So that will be monitored and regulated by NHERC. And in addition to that, in order to verify that all these documents are true, there are also going to be cross verifications by a selected random group of students to see if the institutions truly adhere to what they claim they do. The second part is accreditation, which is going to be taken care by NAC. NAC is straightforward, the explanation is straightforward, National Accreditation Council. So there's going to be a graded system of accreditation, which we saw earlier. So there's going to be a progression from degree granting autonomous colleges to teaching intensive universities to research intensive universities. So there's going to be a graded system of accreditation based on basic norms, public self-disclosure, good governance and outcomes. A specified number of institutions will be recognized as accreditors. So not just NAC will be involved in the whole process of accreditation. There will be NAC, which will give the accreditation recognition to a bunch of institutions, and these institutions will go on to kind of inspect and examine and see where the other institutions stand. So if you see, the layers are going from one tree to several branches. First, there is the Higher Education Commission of India, under which there are 4 different bodies. One of the bodies is NAC, and NAC is not going to be the sole body. It is going to grant the power of accreditation to several institutions, which will then carry the accreditation process forward. The funding part is going to be given by HEGC. So this funding is going to be primarily based on what we talked about earlier, which is the IDP, the Institutional Development Plans. So what the institutional development plans will will encompass is what kind of courses they offer, how they want to structure their courses, what are the different clubs, activities and extracurricular activities that they want to put forth for the student activities, how accountable and how what the degree of autonomy that is being provided to the faculty, what are the different teaching and pedagogical methods that the teaching faculty follow, what are the other infrastructural mechanisms that are available in colleges in terms of labs, internet and other infrastructure, and how diverse the gender balance is, how much representation the SEDGs are being given. All that is going to be part of the IDPs, and these IDPs are going to be one of the primary components which are going to decide how much funding is required for a HEI, that is a higher education institution. This funding is going to be decided by the HEGC. Yeah. So what are the other factors that are going to play a role in the amount of funding that a HEI receives are progress towards implementation. So you can just put forth some IDPs and put some fancy goals, and then 5 years down the line, not even one out of 10 goals are achieved. That doesn't matter at all then. So the IDPs and how they go on from word to the final implementation will also be monitored, and accordingly the funding will be decided by HEGC. The disbursement of scholarships and development funds, this is again towards the institutional development, towards the people who are part of the institution in terms of SEDG, gender diversity and all that. Academic standard setting, this is going to be done by GEC, which is General Education Council. So the first and foremost part, the accreditation is going to be based on learning outcomes. What the student have learned over the course of their education, how diverse and multidisciplinary the learnings is, and what kind of outcomes they have provided or they have come up with, and how these outcomes translate to what career they are going to take up further. So all these are going to be coming together in terms of graduate attributes. So it doesn't state graduate grades or graduate marks or graduate competencies, etc. It states attributes, because attributes combine all of the academic part and the soft skills and the constitutional values, the ethics, integrity and all that, and the extracurricular, co-curricular, club activities and everything else. So that is why this attributes as a part becomes very crucial. That's going to be NHEQF. We saw about NSQF earlier, National Skill Quality Framework, and this is going to be National Higher Education Qualification Framework. This is going to be in sync with NSQF. So what kind of vocational skills that the students learn in course of their education, and what are the other higher education qualification they have will go in tandem with each other. Norms for credit transfer, equivalence, etc. will be framed. This credit transfer equivalence is kind of very crucial, because when the policy talks about bridging different streams and different disciplines towards one degree, there needs to be some sort of matching mechanisms to make sure what course is being what credit and how they pan out towards each other. Let's say a vocational course, if a student is interested towards vocational education and he or she pursues more of that, that shouldn't mean the number of credits that the students earn for, say, pursuing 8 vocational courses should not be equal to 8 theoretical courses or whatever. So that there is some degree of matchmaking that happens between the credit transfer and equivalence, etc. That is going to be taken care of again by GEC. Yeah. Transforming the regulatory system, again, we talked about a light but tight framework that the policy puts forth. So, if these different regulatory bodies will become PSSBs. So, there's going to be a bunch of acronyms and abbreviations that are going to be part of this slide, but we'll see them one by one. So, now let's start with these bodies. So, these are the different regulatory bodies that are regulating the institutions specified to them in the present system. So, Indian Council for Agricultural Research, ICAR, regulates agriculture and allied sciences and all the institutions that are tied to that. Veterinary Council of India regulates institutions that are tied to veterinary education. National Council for Teacher Education regulates the TEIs, or the institutions that provide B.Ed programs. Council of Architecture regulates all the architectural schools, etc., etc. So, all these will become members of, all these will become PSSBs or members. What exactly is PSSBs? Professional Standard Setting Bodies. All these will become members of GEC. What is GEC? We just saw on the previous slide. GEC is General Education Council, which is going to decide the academic standard setting of all the institutions. So, these different regulators will become members of this GEC, and all of them together will act as professional standard setting bodies. Essentially, GEC, and under that there are going to be different bodies which have already been involved in the regulatory mechanisms. Elimination of conflicts of interest to different bodies. Why is the policy doing this? Why is there an umbrella body, and then there are 4 different bodies under that, and then there's going to be different institutions that are going to be given the power of accreditation by the accreditation council, and then these many bodies are going to come as part of GEC, and also there are so many confusions as to who becomes part of what. Why is this being done? The policy says that these are done in order to eliminate conflict of interest. So, if there is one single body that's going to be vested with all the process of accreditation, funding and all that, there's going to be some degree of conflict of interest. So, in order to kind of split out the functions so that the regulatory and accreditatory process happens smoothly, this is being done. Setting up new HEIs will be easier in the new framework. Like I said earlier, private or philanthropic organizations are also going to be given due credits and due importance so that they can also set up HEIs, and the regulatory framework is sort of going to be light but tight. All institutions will be not-for-profit entities, transparent disclosure. This was mentioned in the school education part as well. Any private or any philanthropic or any private-public partnership higher education institutions will be registered as not-for-profit entities. Again, we saw the definition of not-for-profit entities. What are non-profit entities? Non-profit entities are those where the surplus that is, the financial surplus that is being acquired are going to be reinvested back to their sole purpose. For example, if there is an not-for-profit entity that is focused towards rural development, and then they make some 10 products and sell. If there are profits that are being gained out of those sales, that is going to be reinvested again towards developing further rural products or whatever. So, similarly, any not-for-profit entity in the educational stream means that any surplus that they gain in terms of fee, the infrastructural fund and everything else will go back again on their future spending towards education itself. And again, transparent disclosure, this was again mentioned in the previous slide as well. The financial disclosure should be made public. All the spending and expenditure and the income should be made available to public for so that there is some degree of accountability and responsibility in how the institute go about their financial spending. Effective governance and leadership for HEIs. So, this is again one of the most important part of any institution, and specifically higher education institution. Since the policy has talked about large multidisciplinary institutions where 3,000 plus students are going to study, and then there are going to be a plethora of specializations and degrees that are going to be provided by the colleges, it becomes important that a top body or the top leadership is very consistent and very conscious about where the institution need to position itself down the lane and in the present. So, which is why the leadership positions become very important, and there are certain proposals that are put forth by the policy itself. Over the period of next 15 years, that is by 2035 roughly, all HEIs to become independent self-governing institutions pursuing innovation excellence. So, all of them will at some point become autonomous. They will decide their course of action, they will put their own IDPs, and they will get their financials from the body that is going to grant them funds and all that. The board of governors, we saw about this one thing, there's going to be rotational board of governance and all that. The board of governors will govern the institution free of any external interference. So the interference from the red tape mechanism and from the government are going to be very limited as long as the disclosures and the transparency is being maintained to the fullest extent. All HAs will become autonomous and an empowered BOG will be set up by 2035. So autonomous is straightforward. They are going to be free from any shackles of external influence, intervention and governance, etc. And empowered, they will have an empowered board of governors by 2035. These empowered board of governors will kind of decide what is best for the university. Selection of candidates for heads of institutions and leadership positions to be done by an eminent expert committee constituted by the BOG. So this is very important. Selection of candidates for the heads of institutions. Who is going to become the dean? Who is going to become the chancellor? Who is going to become the vice chancellor? Who is going to become the maintenance in charge or whatever? So all the important positions are not going to be arbitrarily decided by some one person or some group of persons. There are going to be an eminent expert committee that consists of excellent people in academics, excellent people in industry who have fared well and who know how an institution should be developed, and this eminent expert committee will be constituted by the BOG, and this EEC will decide who will become heads of institutions. So we have covered the broad areas of higher education in the national education policy. Now we are moving on to the other part. I just wanted to sort of tell something. So that is when you could have seen some sort of difference between how we discussed about the school education part and how we explain about the higher education part. There's a tonal shift that we can sense in terms of what the policy puts forth for school education and what the policy puts forth for higher education. For school education, it comes off more like recommendations and aspirational goal setting and all that. But when it comes to higher education, the policy sort of gets very rigid and kind of gives very pointed regulations and very pointed measures on what the institution should do. It more or less comes to a point where it says there are so many problems in higher education institutions and these need to be rectified in such a short span of time, in 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, 20-year period. So as I said, there is a tonal shift. You need not agree with me. You can go through the policy document and you can clearly see that the first half of where it deals with school education comes off more like friendly advice, and the second comes off more like a stern teacher talking to us. So that's one thing. So we're at the end of how the higher education as envisioned by the policy is being discussed. We're moving on to the other areas of focus. So these are the 5 different areas of focus that are being touched upon. These are not generally covered in the formal education fold as we know it. So professional education, adult education, all these are not part of formal education, as in these are not necessarily going to be restricted to some physical infrastructure and institutions that impart this education. These can occur in informal setting and all that. So there are 5 different areas: professional education, adult education, promotion of Indian languages, technology use, online and digital education. So these 3 we have slightly touched upon at various points throughout the policy. The first 2 are most important and how they are planning to go forth about it. Professional education. So in the professional education, the policy touches upon 4 different types of education. The first is agricultural education, second is legal education, third is healthcare, and fourth is technical. Why does the policy start with agriculture? It doesn't have anything to do with the farm bills, the ongoing protests that are happening. The policy was framed before, just so you know. The agricultural education is very important because there has been a shift from how India was an agricultural based economy at one point in time to how it has become a service based economy now. Service sector gives the majority of revenue and all that, and we know plenty of information about it. So there needs to be certain amount of revamping that needs to happen in the agricultural education so that what is being studied can be implemented according to the changing needs in the agricultural horizon. For example, there are impending problems like climate changes, temperature rises. So how can we go about organic farming, and to what degree can we go to that? What kind of pesticides and fertilizers can be used? So we cannot go about studying the same thing which was used 20 or 30 years ago, because the world has changed a lot in terms of geology, ecology and climate and everything else. So the policy proposes some changes according to that. So first of all, standalone agricultural universities, legal universities, health science, all these are going to become multidisciplinary institutions. In essence, any institution that is offering one program will not continue to offer that. It will offer a plethora of programs. That is one thing. That has been a theme throughout this. The second is why these agricultural universities are being given the adequate focus and emphasis in this policy is being touched upon in this point. 9% of all universities in India are agriculture and allied sciences universities, whereas less than 1% of all enrollment in higher education is related to agriculture. So, out of all the universities, 9% are related to agriculture, but out of all the enrollment, there is only 1% of enrollment. There is some degree of mismatch that is happening, which needs to be addressed and bridged. Agricultural technology parks to promote technology incubation sustainable methodologies. What do these technology parks do? Essentially, they sort of promote research and other ideas that will transform the agriculture as to what is being needed in the present scenario. We can't go about with the traditional modes of agriculture, farming, etc. with the present needs and challenges that we are facing, and that is going to be addressed primarily in terms of agricultural technology park. The second is legal education. So, in the legal education, the policy talks about how there is an urgent need for the students who are learning legal education to know about social justice, political justice, economic justice and all that. For the students to be aware of all this, they should essentially be taught in a bilingual mode, because when it comes to legal education especially, there are going to be a lot of jargons and there is going to be complicated language that makes it difficult for a lot of people to understand and comprehend what is being stated. To kind of mitigate that, the policy encourages bilingual mode to the extent possible. The third is healthcare education, where when it comes to healthcare education, the theme of integration continues here. The policy says that students who are studying allopathic education, which is the allopathic education is the western based medical education. Allopathic education must have an understanding of Ayush as well. So we have an Ayush ministry in our country as well. So what is Ayush? Ayush is Ayurveda, Yoga, Unani, Siddha and Homeopathy. So these 5 different types of medicines are being covered in Ayush. There is a ministry of Ayush as well. So any allopathic student will also get an understanding of Ayush. So there's going to be some level of integration to promote this. Students will be assessed at regular intervals on well-defined parameters primarily required for working in primary care and in secondary hospitals. I am not sure if they kind of forecasted the pandemic was hitting us or whatever, but this is one aspect that needs to be addressed as well, especially in the age of COVID and all that. So students will be assessed at continuous regular intervals, that is okay. This is not just limited to healthcare education, but is prevalent across all educational proposals that is being put forth in this policy. But one thing that is very interesting here is they will primarily be required for working in primary care and in secondary hospitals, which means there is going to be some level of focus and adequate attention that is going to be given to the grassroots medical staffing and all that. Focus on preventive healthcare and community medicine. If you remember right, out of the 6 pillars that the finance minister presented in the union budget recently, the first pillar was health and well-being, and she talked about 3 different types of health and well-being. It was preventive, curative and wellness and well-being. So the policy also kind of aligns with that. It talks about preventive healthcare and community medicine as an area of focus. Technical education. What is technical education? We often misunderstand technical education to be vocational education, but these are broadly different from each other. Technical education is more to do with technology and the latest developments, whereas vocational education is the skills like where there is intense physical work that are involved. So so to kind of give it a broader split, vocational education is where there is physical labor, more of physical labor, whereas technical education is where there is more of mental labor. Technical education is going to be integrated with other disciplines. Why is this important? Again, the policy talks about the age of AI and how machine learning and big data and all that has become important and prevalent in today's world, and why it is important for the students to become aware of all these disciplines so that they could also excel in these fields. So these are some of the fields that are going to be given due attention and focus: AI, 3D machining, big data analysis, machine learning, genomic studies and all that. It established a sort of mechanism for volunteered learning, teaching learning to happen, where some proportion of adults and some proportion of illiterates got educated through peer-to-peer learning and mentoring and volunteering, etc. So this policy uses that as a precedent and wants to take it forward to a bigger extent so that adults get educated. Adult education curriculum framework to be developed separately. So we saw about how differently able students will have to there needs to be a curriculum for them, and now for the adult education also there needs to be some curriculum framework. If you're interested in knowing about curriculum framework, there's something called NCF, National Curriculum Framework. You might want to check it out. That's a very useful document that's being put forth every year or every 2 years. That'll be interesting to see what the changing needs of a dynamic nation, or how the world is changing, and how from one year to another year the curriculum needs are changing, etc., and so on and so forth. So you may want to check it out. It's National Curriculum Framework. You can Google it and find it out. Adult education curriculum framework will be developed focusing on all these. First is foundational literacy and numeracy. For those people who do not even have the basic level of literacy and numeracy important in them. The second is critical life skills. What are life skills? Life skills are not necessarily soft skills. Life skills are those that you need to possess in order for you to interact with the society as a whole. For example, if you go to a bank and then you want to swipe a card and enter your PIN and then withdraw some amount, that is one life skill you'll need to learn. You go to a bank to fill a check, you need to know what you should fill where. So all those are critical life skills. The third is vocational skills development. This is very straightforward: arts, craft, anything else. Basic education. Basic education is some level of mastery in language, maths, science, and some critical disciplines of education. And continuing education, at some part this education should continue and not stop as a 1-year project or a 2-year project. So these are 5 different areas that the policy envisions to touch upon. Usage of schools or school complexes, post-school areas, and during weekends. So this we have seen in some of the movies where the education happens for adults, but the policy proposes that this could be a feasible solution. And earlier, if you remember, schools and school complexes were itself envisioned to be infrastructural places that are going to be highly developed. So the policy says that these complexes or these schools should also have provisions for adult education to happen and all that. AEC, adult education centers, could also be included as part of HEIs. So not just schools, but also HEIs are going to be involved in terms of providing education to adults, and adult education centers are going to be part of HEIs. And instructors are educators to train adults. So this is not just going to be like how, so there is going to be a huge difference between a teacher who is teaching or mentoring students and a teacher who is teaching or mentoring the adults. So instructors or educators should be tuned or should be trained to make sure that their curriculum or their way of teaching should be attuned to what the adults require. These are going to be taken by at 3 levels: national, state, and district levels. Availability and accessibility of books across public and private libraries. This was touched upon at various stages, right from the school education stage as well. Online resources to facilitate learning, and this ties back to critical life skills again. So if the adults are aware about how they can browse or how they can make use of online and digital resources to make sure they educate themselves, then this part becomes very useful to them. Online resources to facilitate learning. Promotion of Indian languages. So this has been touched upon. So this, even though the slide looks very long, this is essentially a summary or a recap of aspects that we touched upon earlier. So the policy first starts with the problem statement, as has been the characteristic, especially ever since we started with the higher education. India has lost 220 languages in the last 50 years, and then UNESCO says 197 Indian languages are in the endangered state. There are only 22 languages as part of the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India, which are being given the adequate and important attention and all that. The remaining languages could go endangered or extinct at any point in time. So we need to give due importance to all the languages and not just 1 or 2 different languages, etc. So in the school education, we saw about the importance of how the multilingualism is going to come into the fold. And we also mentioned at that point that whether it's going to be right or wrong is a debate for another session. But there is some proposal that puts forth the 3-language formula, and the policy also says that any language will not be imposed or forced upon the students. So the multilingualism has been a key factor when it comes to language and culture. Improvement on language teaching, and the teachers are not going to be given language teaching as an additional responsibility, and they are going to be specifically trained and for mastery towards language teaching. And then there are other things, strong departments and programs. This mostly ties to both language and culture. So Indian languages, comparative literature, creative writing, arts writing, Indology, and all that. Essentially, by way of learning different languages, the students or the teachers or the adults should also come to know about the rich heritage and cultural background that India as a country has had so far. So that's one thing. National Research Foundation, NRF, will also fund research that pertains to language and cultural research. High quality programs and degrees in, this is very important, translation and interpretation. So India is home to a wide variety of languages, and there is some dissonance between the transition between one language to another. We find it more easy to transition from our mother tongue to English or some other language, but then we don't have the interconnectedness between the different languages of our country itself. So that is one broad area that the policy sort of puts forth. And then there are going to be art and museum administration, archaeology, artifact conservation, all that. But this comes as the most important for me, at least. Ek Bharat Shrestha Bharat. So this is a scheme that has been put forth by the central government of India for quite some time now. 100 national tourist destinations will be selected throughout the country. So all over India, there will be 100 destinations. The students will be taken to a tour to select destinations, and then they will sort of interact with the local arts and craftsmen and the veterans there and people who have lived for a long time in those places, so that there is a mutual cultural understanding of where the students come from and where the students are visiting as part of this initiative. Sanskrit will be mainstream. This is by far the most controversial topic when it comes to the national education policy. Though the policy talks about multilingualism and all that, it sort of lays down a special emphasis on Sanskrit because the policy states that it is one of the ancient languages and then it has to be given the due importance and all that. Sanskrit is going to be one option in the multilingualism, meaning it will not be forced, but there are going to be extensive resources and support materials that are going to be available when it comes to Sanskrit. There's going to be academies for 8 scheduled languages. These academies for 8 scheduled languages, there are 22 languages in the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India. There will be separate academies for these 22 languages separately. What will these academies do? These academies will essentially find words, find root words, find interconnectedness, and develop periodic dictionaries and make sure there are terms and jargons that are available in each and every language that can be matched with the lingua franca and the other languages of the abroad, etc. So the essentially making sure the language is improved and the language functions are documented and kind of interconnected with the other languages abroad and other languages within India are going to be the functions of these academies. Technology use and integration. So this is again, we have touched upon different things. We touched upon Diksha. Diksha's digital infrastructure for knowledge sharing. This is sort of an educational app and platform that's being developed by the Indian government. We talked about Swayam. Swayam is more like a self-education portal where one can go and select courses and study. And then we talked about ODL, open and distance learning. We talked about how IGNOU, NIOS, SIOS and all the other institutions that are not part of the formal learning per se will be involved in providing education to the students and others. So that is sort of summed up here. Bidirectional relationship between education and technology. So oftentimes, especially ever since pandemic, we have come across a digital divide where some people have the access and wherewithal to educate themselves through online modes, and some other people do not have the infrastructure and access to them. So the policy says that that's a bidirectional relationship between education and technology. The kind of education that we provide will improve the technological advancements, and then these technological advancements will provide mechanisms and frameworks for the education to thrive. So that's the bidirectional relationship. So there's going to be one other forum, which is the National Educational Technology Forum. So this will sort of put forth how education and technology should interact with each other, and how EdTech as a platform should be taken forward in India. So these are going to be the broad functions of NETF. One, independent evidence-based advice to central and state government agencies on technology-based interventions. So what is the evidence-based advice is very important. We cannot simply go and say, give 100 smartphones here and then the educational learning outcomes will increase. There needs to be some data backed in terms of previous experiments to substantiate what needs to be done in terms of technology support, in terms of infrastructure development and all that. So this body is going to provide evidence-based advice. The second is build intellectual and institutional capacities in education technology. So that's important. Intellectual is the ability to use, the ability to get to know, the ability to get acquainted with these technologies that are coming forth. And institutional capacities is the availability of digital technology and the availability of gadgets and the infrastructural capabilities, the internet for example, to be made available. Envision strategic thrust areas in this domain. So which are the different areas that needs to be given importance, whether it's school education, whether it's college education, whether it's non-formal education. So that's going to be decided, and articulate new directions for research and innovation, which is straightforward. So NETF will categorize emerging technologies based on their potential and then see which is feasible, which is not, which needs to be prioritized and all that. So, and the NRF will also come up with specific steps towards AI based education and the research based on AI, since the policy keeps touching upon the importance of AI as a field of disruption. So, advancing core AI research, developing and deploying research. So, essentially NRF amongst several things will fund and sort of develop a community of research. It will also involve research on language, culture and arts of the Indian languages and the local heritage. It will also give specific focused areas like artificial intelligence and machine learning and etc. Awareness about data, privacy, ethical issues surrounding AI. So, whenever we use digital technology and AI in particular, we come across concerns like to whom am I sharing my data with? The privacy, the ethical issues. The ethical issues mostly surrounds around whether an AI technology will disrupt the labor force negatively, whether it will result in a loss of employment for many people and all that. So that is one thing. So all these are going to be broad overarching themes of how the technology use is going to come up in India as envisioned by the policy. The last is online and digital education, ensuring equitable use of technology. So again, this we talked about. Equitable use is important. We can develop hundreds and thousands of technologies all over, and then if it's not made available to all these people, especially in the context of education is a public good. Everything being said and done, it's a public good still. So if there's no equitable access or if there's no availability to all the people, then the technological development or disruption becomes meaningless for at least one chunk of the population. So that needs to be addressed. Need to bridge the digital divide. So this has become very rampant, especially, and it's become very apparent in the context of COVID-19 and how the schools have shut down and how alternative modes of education are being sought out. So through Digital India campaign and affordable computing devices, etc. The next is there needs to be some level of blending that needs to happen between online learning and offline learning. So the policy says that even if there comes a point where online learning becomes mainstream and then students start learning from online platforms and portals, etc., even after that, there should be some level of interaction based on experiential learning and activity based learning, so that the online learning does not become a sort of screen based education that affects the locomotive and motor abilities of the students. So the recommendations are these. We need to have enough evidence to see the scope of how online education can develop in India. So pilot studies for that. Develop digital infrastructure, be it servers, internet, availability of internet, availability of gadgets and phones, etc. Online teaching platforms and tools. There are Diksha Swayam. So recently, I think on around February 8th or 9th, the Ken ran an article on how Diksha is being plagued with different sort of problems in terms of how the app loads or how different people have to use it but are not using it, etc., etc. So that needs to be bridged. Online teaching platforms and tools need to be developed, and then the usage needs to be communicated to the stakeholders properly, and the sustainability and the availability of it needs to be ensured on a long-term basis. Fourth is content creation, digital repository and dissemination. So first, you can develop 1000 tools you want, but then if the tool doesn't contain anything inside it, that becomes meaningless. So it becomes important that these online tools contain huge repositories of educational content inside them. And then addressing the digital divide, which we have talked about. Virtual labs. What are virtual labs? Virtual labs are essentially, let's say, essentially how we learn some experiment through YouTube, for example. So virtual labs are those where the students get to watch something happening and then learn the craft by themselves. Training and incentive for teachers, online assessment, blended modes, laying down standards, etc., etc. So the policy says that there will be some point, it's going to happen in a phased and structured manner. There's going to be some point where the online assessment and online tools become mainstream, and at that point, examinations and assessments will start becoming online entirely. So blended modes of learning, until that, we touched about that here. And then laying down standards. To what extent can online tools be introduced in the different parts of education, and what should be their functionalities in terms of blended learning? So that those are the standards that should be laid down. So I think we are at the end of what are the other key areas of focus that the educational policy touches upon. Now, this is just a brief about what the policy gives as a set of guidelines for this to be implemented practically across the country. So first, the strengthening the CAB. CAB is Central Advisory Board of Education. So this is going to work in tandem with MHRD to develop, to kind of see the practical difficulties, roadblocks, hardships, and the tweaks that need to be done so that this policy gets implemented throughout the country in an effective manner. So this CABE will work in tandem with MHRD, and the MHRD itself will be redesignated as MOE. MOE is Ministry of Education, and then educational expenditure will increase to 6% of GDP as against approximately 4.4 to 4.5% that we are spending now. Apart from one-time capital expenditure, spending on the following is essential. So what is capital expenditure? Capital expenditures are anything that we spend one time for it. So if we purchase a mic or the screen, for example, it's a capital expenditure, whereas any recurring expenditure is non-capital. So apart from capital expenditure, these are different types of expenditures that need to be taken into account for the policy to be effectively implemented. So ECC, there needs to be enough focus in terms of the infrastructure, teachers and human resources and everything else. Foundational literacy and numeracy, the books, the materials, the play-based learning and the infrastructural support that needs to be put in place for that. Third, providing adequate and appropriate resourcing of school complexes and clusters. We talked about how school complexes will enable resource sharing and all that. So that is one thing that needs to be kept in mind. Providing food and nutrition. So if you remember right, when we talked about the school education, we talked about there has been an effective midday meal scheme that has been implemented across different states, but that needs to be expanded towards giving students an energizing breakfast as well. So that is being breakfast and midday meals are being covered here. Investing in teacher education, CPD of teachers. So appointment of high quality teachers, merit based progression, promotion based on their career achievements, no arbitrary transfers, providing institutional support, etc., etc. And CPD in terms of, in school education we saw about how every teacher is going to be subjected to 50 hours of courses and online learning so that he or she can develop their competencies further. Revamping colleges and universities to foster excellence, this is pretty straightforward. Cultivating research and extensive use of technology and online education. So these are the broad areas of spending that the policy envisions, and then finally these are the mechanisms through which the spending should occur. So GFR and PFMS are two different mechanisms that the policy puts forth as to how the institutions should spend their money and how the funding should be allocated to them. GFR is General Financial Rule and PFMS is Public Financial Management System. So this is more of a transparency enabling system that will make sure the funding expenditure and the allocation of funding is made accessible to all people. And just in time, so this is very important. More often than not, there are institutions where they have expressed the need for funding. They have given specific reasons to why they need that funding, and then due to some red tape or due to institutional roadblocks, the fund does not get released on time, and then the project is put on hold, and after that the project doesn't come to fruition at all, since the timing is the most important. So just in time release of fund will also be enabled through institutional mechanisms to enable timely release of funds and avoid parking of funds. So this parking of funds has been plaguing educational institutions for quite some time. What happens is, let's say there are some 1,000 crores that are going to be allocated toward one scholarship, and then for some reason, for example, now the pandemic stuck, and then for some reason it didn't happen, and then making sure this fund gets released at some point in time, or making sure this allocation happens once again, becomes a huge headache, and that's going to be avoided. So these are the broad principles for implementation. There are around 7 to 8 of them. So the policy says that, so the committee itself says that, see, we have provided a lot of proposals for changes. These cannot be implemented in one go, so you better go step by step. So that's the broad one-liner that they seem to state, but they're giving more polite 8-point statement here. The first is implementation of spirit and intent of the policy. It's not important to go about implementing the multilingualism or the 3-language formula right away. What the policy wants to achieve, what is the rationale behind so many points that are being stated in this policy is more important than implementing it step by step. Okay, step 1, foundational literacy, let's implement this. Step 2, preparatory stage, let's implement. That's not important. More important is the fact that the policy envisions a seamless transition between so many stages of education. So that's what the first point states. The second is phased implementation. You cannot go about doing changes in like one academic year or in a period of 6 months. There should be some level of, let's say in 1 year we want to be here, in the next year we can do this, in the 3rd year we can improve student enrollment, in the 4th year we can develop infrastructure, some sort of phased implementation. The third is prioritization of the most important and urgent steps first, followed by the next. So if you remember right, in the start of the higher education institution part as well, we talked about how by 2030 all the existing educational institutions will become multidisciplinary, and by 2040 these multidisciplinary institutions will then focus on improving their enrollment rates. So that is a sort of example that was already given. So there should be some prioritization mechanisms. Comprehensiveness, one aspect of the policy being implemented and the other aspect being left out is not doesn't help the policy getting implemented at all. Rather, we would not implement it at all. So the policy states that if it gets implemented, it should be implemented thoroughly and all stages should be implemented, not just one part of it. Concurrent subject. So as we know, education is a concurrent subject. I know there are quite a few instances where the policy seemed to state that it's a central subject, and it practically seems that there's going to be some level of centralization that's going to happen. Nevertheless, education in theory still happens to be concurrent subject, and so there needs to be careful planning and joint monitoring between the state and central governments and the other level of local governments and the district level authorities, so that this policy can be implemented effectively across the country. So the next is timely infusion of adequate resources. This we saw in the last slide where we talked about just-in-time allocation of financial resources, whereas this talks about all kinds of resources, whether it's human, whether it's infrastructural, whether it's financial, everything else. So that needs to be given a timely importance. So final is careful analysis and review of the multiple parallel linkages. So if we sort of bring in play-based education in the ECC curriculum, and then that needs to be phased out gradually so that the students attune themselves to formal learning. Suddenly introducing one aspect and then that not being followed up in some other part of education doesn't have any value to it. So when one part of the policy gets implemented, care and diligence has to be given to how it affects the other parts of the policy. So these are the broad areas of the implementational guidance that the policy gives. With this, we sort of come to the end of how we talked about national education policy. The fact is that there are going to be debates, there are going to be pros and cons of any policy, and I personally have my particular stances against this policy or for this policy, but that's not the aim of this video. This video was more aimed at giving a glimpse of how a 66-67 page policy can be covered in a span of 2 to 3 hours. Hope you find it useful. Thank you.